My name is Biljana Stanko. I'm professor of applied studies at Novi Sad School of Business, Republic of Serbia. I will present to you research titled Comparative Analysis of the Social Dimension in the Higher Education Strategies of the EU member states and candidate countries. This research I prepared with my colleague Nataša Papić-Blagojević. First of all, I will talk about problem and subject of the research. The research problem is related to the commitment to the social dimension and implementation of strategy of equity in the EU member states and candidate countries. The subject of the research are four indicators that indicate: first, implementation of strategy on equity in higher education; second, definition and measurability of objectives; third, undertaking of social dialogue on the adoption of the strategy; and fourth, monitoring of the improvement of the social dimension while ensuring equality, respect of diversity, and encouraging inclusion. In this paper, we pay special attention to the social dimension of the EU higher education. The emergency and functioning of the European Union has always been based on respect for the principles of equality, fairness, and inclusion. The implementation of the social dimension in national higher education systems has become a very important issue over time, to which the European Union and the European higher education area have been paying even more attention in the last 2 decades. In the beginning of the 21st century, the application and respect of the principles of equality and inclusion in education became some very important topics. According to many researchers, the problem of inequality in higher education in Europe is widespread and, in the same time, very complex. Modern higher education with a pronounced social note must provide equal educational opportunities for all interested individuals with respect for the established quality standards and in accordance with the needs of each individual and wider social community. At the core of the European education system are fairness and inclusion, as key values which are mentioned as priorities within the European Strategy for Universities, which was presented at the beginning of 2022. The degree of inclusion of social disadvantaged and vulnerable groups in the higher education system in the European Union is still insufficient. One could even say low. It is a fact that certain knowledge, competencies, and skills can only be acquired through different types of higher education, and therefore its availability to all categories of young people is of crucial importance. Higher education can have a significant impact on solving the problem of social and economic inequality in society. Many European countries implement various activities to make higher education opportunities transparent and bring them closer to potential students, but information on the social affiliation or ethnic origin of students is still missing, so it is very difficult to gain insight into the achieved level of social inclusion in higher education. In further research, we used the juridic report from 2022. It is about equity and inclusion in higher education in Europe, and it examines the commitment to the social dimension in higher education at the level of the educational system through the following criteria application. First, implementation of a strategy on equity in higher education. Second, existence of clearly defined objectives and measurable targets. Third, conducting social dialogue before adopting the strategy. 4. Monitoring the existence and implementation of the policy of improving the social dimension in higher education. The strategy of higher education must have a social dimension in its focus that will support equal opportunities for all students, starting from the moment of application and enrollment through the period of study and until the end of studies. Each individual in that series of steps must progress only on the basis of his own abilities, and the life circumstances of the student and other factors that he cannot influence must be left aside. First indicator in our research is the implementation of the strategy with social dimension or national plan of similar content in the higher education systems of the EU member states and candidate countries. The strategy must necessarily support equality, encourage diversity and inclusion. Almost all EU member states, as we see in the table, have at least one strategy or national plan that deals with the social issues of students in higher education with an emphasis on equity and inclusion. In Slovakia, such a strategy is currently being prepared, while in Germany, Denmark, Luxembourg, and Belgium, the educational systems are currently without this strategy. Among the EU candidate countries, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Turkey stand out as they have this strategy and equity into their national higher education systems. The research points out that the social dimension is only one of the aspects of higher education strategies in the analyzed countries. That is, that only in Croatia, Cyprus, Netherlands, Austria, and Finland is the strategy based exclusively on the social dimension. A second indicator in our research is inclusion of clearly defined objectives and measurable targets in the strategy of equity in higher education of EU member states and candidate countries. In order to be able to measure the contribution of the strategy of equity in higher education and evaluate its implementation effectiveness, it is necessary that the objectives of the strategy are clearly defined and quantitatively measurable. It is very important to recognize and feel a strong orientation towards social issues in the objectives and targets. EU member states whose strategies on equity in higher education are based on specific objectives and measurable targets are Austria, Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, Hungary, Lithuania, Poland, Portugal, Slovenia, and Sweden. On the other hand, in Ireland, Greece, Spain, Croatia, Italy, Malta, and Netherlands, clearly defined objectives within the strategies stand out, but their quantification was missing. No measurable targets in these countries. Bulgaria, France, and Romania have strategies in their educational systems, but it is obvious that the strategies are not based on important pillars such as clear objectives and measurable targets. In Serbia and Turkey, clearly defined objectives and measurable targets appear within the strategies, but in North Macedonia, objectives on equity in higher education have been defined, but without the possibility of measuring their realization. Next indicator is about social dialogue, conduction, and adoption of the strategy on equity in higher education. Establishing social dialogue before adopting the strategy will certainly contribute to its more successful incorporation into the higher education system and more efficient application in practice. It is very important that all interest parties are consulted before adopting a strategy on equity in higher education. The data presented in the table lead to the conclusion that most often before the strategy of higher education with a pronounced social dimension is adopted in the EU member states and candidate countries, public dialogue is first established. Most often, representatives of Ministry of Education, heads of higher education institutions, experts in the field of higher education are involved in social dialogue. In a smaller number of cases, representatives of employee unions, non-governmental organizations, student organizations, and other levels of education, as well as international organizations, were also involved. Serbia, Turkey, and North Macedonia held a social dialogue before adopting a strategy on equity in higher education, and in Albania, social dialogue is ongoing. As we see in the table, Bosnia and Montenegro are without strategy. The last indicator that we researched is the monitoring the implementation of a strategy on equity in higher education institutions in EU member states and candidate countries. In this case, for research purposes, EUREDIC collects data on whether the authorities in EU member states and other countries require quality assurance agencies to monitor the process of implementing a strategy or national plan on equity in higher education. The agency monitoring system also includes checking the existence of a policy for social dimension improvement, which is based on respect for diversity, inclusion, and ensuring equality. The presented data does not give an optimistic picture. In slightly more than half of the EU member states, there is a request for agency monitoring and verification of whether institutions of higher education implement policies to improve the social dimension. On the other hand, there is no monitoring in the remaining countries. The situation is even more unfavorable in the case of countries that are not EU members. At the end of the presentation, we conclude that fair education for all and equal opportunities for all are the priorities of modern European society. In order to create a society in which every individual is offered the same opportunities, it is very important to remove all obstacles, especially social inequalities, which are present in higher education in Europe. Individual inclusion and possibilities of contribution to society depend on the level of personal education. Most of the EU member states and half of the candidate countries are strongly committed to the social dimension of higher education. Thank you for your attention.